Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Whalen. Welcome to Insights from Casetext. I'm here in the WeWork Kansas City studio, and in this series, I'm talking to friends about writing. Today, I am talking to Karen Skinner. Karen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Cool. Thank you again for joining us. Usually when we start these conversations, what I like to do is let people just rant a little bit, tell me what's on their mind. So let me give you a couple minutes. Tell me what's moving you right now. What's on your mind?
There are so many things on my mind right now. I could rant for ages about, God, all kinds of things that would probably turn off your listeners. So I won't do that. Instead, I'm going to limit my rant to something that has always really disturbed me that has to do with legal writing. And that is that essentially what we have done as lawyers is we have created through legal writing a monopoly that impedes people's access to justice. So to me, good legal writing is an access to justice issue more than it is almost anything else. We have created a monopoly. And we've done it for a lot of reasons. We've done it over generations and hundreds of years as lawyers, but we have used our words to create this barrier that prevents other people from accessing the law. And we've built our business on communication, so we've essentially established ourselves as the translators or the interpreters, the necessary middlemen in the access that people have to the justice system and even to understanding the rules that surround them and on a daily basis. We created these rules that are just too difficult or written in a way that is too complicated for many people to really understand. So we've created for ourselves this great monopoly. We get to be the ones who do the interpreting, and we've done it through words. You know, we've created this environment and this whole system of rules that people find difficult to maneuver through, difficult to understand. And we've done it by building our own dictionary, building our own vocabulary, our own ways of speaking and of presenting information to the public, instead of thinking about what it is that we really need to do, which is to ensure that people understand the rules and the environment and the society that they live in, that they understand the rules that apply to them, that they understand what their documents mean when they go to buy a house, that they shouldn't have to need a lawyer to do that. Obviously, it's very self-interested from our part to have created this system because then they need us. But instead, we've created a set of rules that people don't understand, and we've done worse than that in some places. We've locked up that legislation, those rules that govern the way people have to behave. We've locked that up behind paywalls in a lot of places. People can't even access the laws to really understand. They can't go online right now and maybe access a bill for an act that's going to impact them and read the full text of that bill so they actually understand what it means. And it's written in a way, even if they could access it, that they don't understand what it means. And that's a huge problem for us. You know, in Canada, we have free access to all of the laws and regulations and most of the case law as well. So people can get it, but we've still created a system where they don't understand it. I had one fantastic tax professor who has since passed away, but he was a professor of law at McGill, and he was the tax professor. He would stand up in front of the class and he would pull off his glasses and he would read a piece from the Tax Act, and then he would stare up at the class and he'd look at us all and say, "Well, what the hell do you suppose that means?" And nobody knew what it meant because it was written in this way that was impossible to understand. So we've used language to create this monopoly and this barrier that really is an access to justice issue as far as I'm concerned. You know, plain language is a really important movement in a lot of fields, but it's had a lot of trouble really getting grounding, really getting a foothold in law because, you know, if anybody could just grab that Tax Act and read it and understand it, they wouldn't need a tax attorney. They wouldn't need a real estate lawyer to help them necessarily draft up a deed for their house, and they would understand the criminal codes, and maybe they could represent themselves more fully and more safely in front of the courts. So they wouldn't need us. Instead, we created legalese. We created this way that we have to be involved in all of these acts between people that really shouldn't need a lawyer, but because no one can understand what we've written in legalese, they need us.
If I'm understanding you correctly, you're identifying a big social problem, which is that not that our writing is bad, because that term doesn't help much, but that it's inaccessible.
Yeah,
but
it is.
That also there's an economic incentive in continuing that. So really, in my mission in this series and in your mission as you're talking to lawyers to encourage them to write better and to write more accessibly, realistically, that's not going to happen unless we give them an economic incentive that replaces the current one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that is a problem. But there is a lot more pressure now to improve people's access to justice. And there are movements here, there are movements in the United States that really are aimed at getting people better access to the law. And until the legislation changes, which it won't, we can at least make sure that our communications with our clients are written in plain language. That, one way to shift the incentives actually is to start thinking about flat fees for more things. So if you have to write a contract, if you have to negotiate a transaction, for example, and you have a flat fee for that, then you have to find out how to write your contract better, how to make it much clearer for both parties to understand what's going on, so that you spend less time negotiating and less time explaining it to clients. Because once you shift away from being paid by the hour, or as we used to be, paid by the word, you change the incentives. You have to write more clearly. You don't have the time to waste in negotiations and rounds and rounds and rounds of drafting.
Paid by the word is just a fascinating dynamic.
That's why if you read a contract, it'll say cease and desist instead of stop. That's why it'll say give, devise, and bequeath in a will instead of just give.
Yeah. So we're going to get into kind of the economic justification to do something better. But before I do that, I wanted to give you a chance to just tell me about your background a little bit. You're coming at this question from a unique angle, and so let me know about that angle. What's your background?
Okay, well, I ended up in law in a rather circuitous way because I started out in sciences. So I was used to reading complex documentation and things, but from a very scientific perspective. And I have a degree in microbiology and immunology. From there, I went to law. But I've always been fascinated with languages. So the ability to work in multiple languages is important to me. And I think one of the things I enjoyed about law is the focus on language and the importance of selecting the right word for the right meaning and the nuances that are involved in the way that we write. So to me, the writing and the law were very closely intertwined. And even when it comes down to things like drafting, the way that you draft is very much dependent on the language that you're using and the structure of that language. I used to work, when I first started out, I was working for Stikeman Elliott, which is a large Canadian law firm, and we had an office in Budapest in Hungary. So I worked in Hungary for a couple of years, and I worked on the privatization of the electricity industry. And there we were not only selling the electricity industry as it was eventually broken up and sold it as 15 different companies. But we were doing that in two languages all the time. So all of the information that had to go out to tender all had to be in English and Hungarian. And then at the same time, we had to build a regulatory framework for this new industry. And that also had to be in English and Hungarian. But when you looked at drafting legislation at the same time in English and Hungarian, there was all these translation issues back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that caused incredible amounts of waste. And I've always been very passionate about reducing waste and making everything more efficient in the way that I work, in the way that people work around me. But when you've got two completely different approaches to a piece of legislation, like, for example, you have to do a list. You have to comply with conditions A, B, C, and D. I mean, something completely different than A, B, C, or D. But in Hungarian, they wouldn't put the conjunction in. So in their normal way of drafting legislation, you had to understand the context to understand whether you had to meet 1 out of 4 or all 4 conditions. So that caused problems. But because of that idea of this constant translation, it was so wasteful that we had to develop a new way to write in 2 languages at once. So we started what my colleague and I called simul drafting, whereas she would say, okay, we need to get this point across, and she would write it in Hungarian and I would write it in English, and we'd talk back and forth till we were sure that those 2 paragraphs said exactly the same thing, and then we never had to do a translation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're touching on something that gets back to your original point, I think it's fascinating. I had a case where a protective order was filed against my client, and his parents, some of the witnesses were Moroccan. And so we have this constitutional requirement that if people are going to be affected by something the state does, then they have to be able to understand it. And so we go to this hearing, and they had a translator who was from Jordan, and Jordanian and Moroccan Arabic were so different that we actually got a different translator. I just find it fascinating that we have this constitutional requirement to have someone translate it into Moroccan Arabic, but we don't have somebody who's required to translate it into English. But that's a different aside. You are, let me just, to nerd, you are a Lean Six Sigma black belt.
I am.
Which just sounds really cool. And as somebody who watched 30 Rock, is also sort of funny. I want to come at this conversation in a way that's a little different than you might have expected. And I'm going to do it by pointing people to a book. This is a book by a writer about writing. The book is called The War of Art. And it's by Stephen Pressfield. And Stephen Pressfield is a writer. He's a novelist. He wrote Legend of Bagger Vance and a book about Thermopylae. I think it's called Pillars of Fire. And in this book, he talks about the exercise of going pro. It's the distinction between being someone who occasionally writes and being a professional writer. And you and I, because we come from a manufacturer, I come from supply chain, and you have this Lean Six Sigma background. Sometimes when we talk to lawyers about improving systems or whatever, they think it's esoteric. They think it's not necessary. But I want to frame this the way Stephen Pressfield would, which is we're going to go from the occasional writer, the person who occasionally comes up with winning ideas, and we're going to go pro. And the distinction between those two, what Stephen Pressfield says, is habits. And I would submit that habits are just systems. And so we're going to talk about systems. So explain to me, if you would, in the briefest way possible, what is lean?
Okay. So Lean and Six Sigma, I'll talk about them both and then give you a bit of a distinction between them. But Lean and Six Sigma are business improvement methodologies. They started in manufacturing in different areas of the world, but they started in manufacturing as different approaches to improving the way that a product was produced. And they have slightly different focuses. So Lean is a business improvement strategy that's really focused on adding more value and eliminating waste. So you look at a process going from, intake of a new client to closing of their real estate deal, let's say, getting the keys to the house, and you look at all the places along there where you're adding value. What steps in that process add value? What steps in that process are really wasteful? And there's a whole school of knowledge or book of knowledge around what wastes are. And the goal in Lean is to make sure that you have a process that adds as much value as possible and reduces as much of that waste as possible, because anything that's wasteful isn't adding any value, isn't getting you closer to the final product, which may be, the keys to your house, for example. Six Sigma has also started in manufacturing, and Six Sigma is really focused on improving that efficiency and that quality of the final output of the keys to your house. But it's focused on the elimination of defects and errors and variations. So they both really try to deliver the same thing, which is a more efficient, more high quality product at the end. And they just come at it a slightly different way. Lean through this concept of adding value and eliminating waste, and Six Sigma through this idea of reducing defects and reducing variation so that your product is always the same at the end, or as similar as possible. And because in law, we know that our products are not always the same, and our product is really the service that we are delivering. For us, we tend to focus on Lean in our consulting business, because for us, this idea of looking at how we deliver our services to clients through the window of waste and value is more easily understood and more easily applied in our knowledge-based profession.
The term lean, I've heard many organizations in around law that say we run a very lean operation, which I think is code for we don't have enough employees, and so all of us are really stressed and crying ourselves to sleep at night, which is not the same thing
Not at all.
as being lean. But I let me take this focus and again to contextualize it. When we're trying to avoid waste and we're trying to avoid errors, the way Stephen Pressfield talks about it in the context of writing, he uses the term the resistance, the capital R resistance, which I think he took from Carl Jung. And the resistance is all the things that make it so we don't do our best writing work, that we don't generate the insights, that we don't do quality work. And really, waste and errors, that's the resistance, right? So again, I would strongly encourage anybody to go read that book, The War of Art. And then to contextualize it in this way of saying we're going to build systems, i.e. habits, that overcome waste and mistakes or errors, and analogizing that to that resistance. Because as we build the systems that overcome those things, we're going to deliver better for clients. I want to also make a reference to something that you've said several times. When I explained to somebody the supply chain, they said to me, what is it? Who cares? Why should a lawyer care? And my answer was, look, that all the supply chain does is get people what they want, when they want it, with an experience that makes them feel like they got a good value, right? That's kind of a description of the value chain writ large or the supply chain. But again, it's all fundamentally getting people what they want, when they want it, with a good experience. That's it. And what we tend to do, I read a book called The Content Trap that's about this. We tend to focus on the substance of the thing we're making, words, paper, motions, whatever it is. And we think that's the good that's being delivered. But that's not what the client wants. And because that's not what the client wants, we're not getting what they want when they want it with a good experience, because we're creating the wrong thing. We're focusing on the wrong thing. So tell me how that first step that you seem to be alluding to is we need to optimize for the thing that people actually want. Talk to me about that.
Well, I think the biggest issue that we have, there are a couple of things about trying to introduce lean thinking to law firms. And you're absolutely right. People say, oh, I run a really lean operation. That means they don't have any staff supporting them. But what they're not really using lean in the correct way. They're using it in a more sort of colloquial way. But when we start working with a firm that really wants to look at efficiency and delivering their legal services better, faster, cheaper, we start with two things. We start with value and we start with waste. And in lean, to be valuable, and this gets back to what you were just saying, but to be valuable, something has to move the matter forward. So 37 turns of a document, it's not moving it forward. So that wouldn't be considered value adding. So it's something that moves you towards the solution or the outcome. It has to be what the client wants and needs and is willing to pay for. And it has to be done right the first time. Those are the three value criteria. But those are all client-based. They all really are from the client's perspective. It has to be moving your matter or your case or whatever it is that you're delivering. Your service has to move towards the end, the output. And the output has to be viewed from the client's perspective. Everything from lean, and this is a big shift we have to make with firms, is you have to start looking at everything you do from the perspective of, is it what the client wants? Is it what the client needs? Is the client willing to pay for it? Is it moving things forward? But it's always from the client's perspective. We start with the client. And because I think we often don't listen enough when we're listening to our clients, we have an immediate perception of what that might be, that final solution, that thing that the client wants, that value. But there's often not an alignment between what the lawyer thinks the client wants and what the client wants.
If theoretically, I'm only billing for those things, that time spent, that moves the ball forward, isn't that the most efficient way to bill? It's the most tied to results?
I don't think so. I think it's a shortcut for value. And I think that, there may be cases where you can't think of any other way to figure out what to bill your client for an act, a task, an outcome that you produce. But it's certainly not the only way, and it's certainly not necessarily the most efficient way, because it creates inefficiencies. You spend time writing it down. You spend time negotiating with your client about what you're going to charge them. You spend time doing a whole lot of other things that you can't bill for, or you bill for things like you said, if everybody was absolutely accurate about writing down exactly, billing only for the time they actually spent. But that's very, very difficult to do. And we know in law that as much as we'd like that to be the truth, it isn't the truth. And people don't always bill properly for what they've done. They may overbill, they may underbill. It's the way that we've chosen to accurately represent what we do, but I don't think it is an accurate representation of what we do.
Well, let me contextualize this then to the writing, because I think if we're talking about reducing waste, for example, and efficiently getting to moving the ball, frankly, LegalZoom wins, right? Because if what my client does is goes in and checks a box and says, I want X, and it immediately produces words that they can then print that will accomplish X. I'm seeing in legal processes, there are certain legal processes that frankly are easier to use these principles than others. And in that scenario, LegalZoom's doing really well at it. In the context of insight generation and of writing, I give the example of overproduction, right? In the supply chain, we don't like stuff sitting in boxes in warehouses. And so one of the main principles of lean is to get rid of the stuff that's sitting in warehouses to make it so we're only building what's needed. Mm-hmm. But when you're writing, just by nature, you're creating more than is needed. You're creating, you're drafting, you're writing, you're thinking through stuff, knowing that you're about to cut most of that because it doesn't deliver to the client, but that process is necessary to get to the insights that's actually what the client wants. So how do we make that work together? How do we focus on using these tools for insight generation, not just form generation?
I think there is an area where overdrafting is waste, but there is also an area where we use writing as a way to create ideas. So when you're writing a novel or when you're writing a legal document, whatever it is that you're writing, frequently what we do is we put all of the ideas that are coming into our head down in that document. We know that we're then going to spend time looking at all of those ideas, all of those possible cases that might help or might not help, all of the evidence that we have, the facts. We write it all down. We look at it. We then spend time, and this is where the insight comes in. We spend time looking for patterns, looking for the kernels that are the most important. We cull all of that down into what is finally the product that we produce, whether it's a motion or it's a factum for the Supreme Court or whatever it happens to be. We use the tool of writing to cull our ideas, to then create a structure for our ideas and build an argument that makes sense. And that's all really important. And that's not wasteful because that's adding value. That is moving towards your final output. Sometimes it takes writing it all down. And yeah, individually, maybe you're wasting words, maybe you're wasting energy on your keyboard, but that's all part of the way that we think and part of the way that we generate cohesive arguments, that we generate new ideas because we can look at them and see them presented against each other on a piece of paper or on a screen and really spend time thinking about them. But we need sometimes to have those in front of us to think about. You know what it's like when you're drafting from scratch. It's much more difficult to draft from scratch than it is to take an existing precedent or template and then use the ideas that are in there plus the new information that you have coming in to create a really solid document. So I don't think that the type of writing that you're talking about is overproduction, and it's certainly not wasted if you're using it to build your cohesive arguments. Where it shifts to waste for me is where you have so many extra turns of the document that are making tiny little stylistic changes that are not moving the matter forward, that are actually holding it up. And that happens a lot. We have one client who would like to charge flat fees for a particular type of commercial litigation and will for most clients, but when he knows that a certain firm is on the other side of a transaction, he won't, because he knows that that firm will do 35 turns of a document that really takes 5 to get right. one of the things that we do when we're creating that really good solid argument, or we should be doing when we're creating that really good solid argument out of all of the information that we've culled down, is to then take that and create a template from it, or a precedent, or a starting point. We often with clients will call them starting points, so that you know that some of that really good solid language is there every time, and then you don't have to recreate that. Then you spend your time and your energy and your creative value add as a lawyer to amend it, to tweak it, to add in the new facts if that's what you're dealing with, to adjust for different contingencies in your commercial transaction if that's what you're dealing with. But you have this really good solid starting point so that you are not reinventing the wheel every time, because reinventing the wheel is definitely waste.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between running a lean R&D department and a lean warehouse, right? And it's defined by the function, as you mentioned. If the function is to be R&D, which is essentially what this writing exercise is, this insight generation is, if part of that function is throwing stuff against the wall, trying ideas, creating what you can, and seeing what works, then to do that work is not waste, right? It is by definition part of the process. Another kind of waste that I wanted to talk about was the underutilized or unutilized talent waste. And the idea in lean is that if you've got staff, if you've got employees who are put in a position that they're not qualified for, they're not ready for, then you've got talent that's misaligned with the work. If lawyers are in the position that we are of insight generation, and again, I personally believe that that's a certain kind of lawyer, the lawyers who want a lawyer, but that's generally the Casetext audience because they're doing research. That group, if they're not doing the stuff that it takes to become excellent at that, then they are unutilized talent, which is a waste. How do you think that we can use lean principles to improve how lawyers train themselves and how we train lawyers?
This is a question that comes up all the time, because when we talk in law firms about getting things done right the first time, they always throw back at us, well, no, that's how we train our associates. We train our juniors. We give them work to do. They do it wrong. They pass their brief that they've spent 6 hours on. They pass it to the legal assistant. She puts it in the bin because she's been doing it for 20 years and she can write it in her sleep. And that's true. We do spend time training that way. And that is, I suppose, a waste. But from my perspective, it's not a waste in terms of training. If you're actually spending time correcting and helping and mentoring along the way, then the way that we've trained our lawyers isn't necessarily waste. Where it becomes waste is when you build a client for it. So, if you think about those 3 value criteria I talked about, is the client willing to pay for it, and is it done right the first time? That's where this really comes in. This idea of, if we're training people to do something and they spend too long doing it, then that's a waste, and I should just do it myself. And we do have that problem all the time too. Someone will say, it takes me 30 seconds. It's faster for me to do it myself than it is for me to teach my associate to do it. Right. The problem is that you might do it yourself 60 times and you only have to teach the associate once. If you teach the associate once and it takes a little bit longer, that's still okay, because in the end, the associate is doing the job that they're trained to do and you're doing things that are more value adding. And that's really important. But just to go back to the drafting for a second and the training, it's okay to give your associate tasks that she gets wrong the first time or even the second time. That's okay. What isn't okay is billing the client for it. The client shouldn't be expected to pay, let's say $200 an hour for a brand new associate who doesn't even know where the photocopy machine is. So you really have to think in terms of lean principles, you have to think about it from that perspective of, I'm going to train my lawyers with a bit of trial and error, and that's okay. Trial and error is a really important way to learn, but I can't bill the client for it.
Yeah, part of the pricing difficulty of the billable hour is that we're not pricing in things that normal businesses price in, like loss, risk, training. These are things that you better believe that when you go to Walmart and you buy a box of pasta, some portion of the $1.38 you pay for that pasta box is going toward training. Some portion is going to risk. Some portion is going to loss. And when we bill by the hour, and that's as complex as our pricing gets, obviously we're not billing in for the things that should naturally be built in.
Yeah,
And
but
so
when
we're
you start pricing for
we're encouraging
value, you do start thinking about those things. You start thinking about your work differently. You start thinking about how much time the legal assistant is spending on that, whatever it is, whatever service you're providing. And you have to build that cost in as well. So it really forces you to be a lot more aware of all the input costs.
Well, getting again back to writing, I was thinking about switching costs. It's really popular right now to talk about switching costs, and this creates a kind of operations waste. And the idea is that if your line in your warehouse is jumping from thing to thing, then the first thing is not processed through, right? It takes longer because every time you have to switch from this kind of die to this kind of die, you've got a cost, right? And that cost adds up. With solo lawyers, which again is a big part of our audience, we're doing switching costs all day, right? And we're creating systems that allow clients to switch us. I remember going to a legal conference, and one of the speakers said that what clients have said that they wanted is for us to be available by text all the time, which of course is not access. That's accessibility. That's a different thing. And being infinitely accessible means we can't do that R&D work of generating the insights, which is actually what the clients want when they want an expert, right? So how do we as solos make sure that we don't have those switching costs, that we either, maybe through blocking time or through outsourcing, how can we get rid of those things that make us less efficient and more error prone because we keep jumping around?
Well, there's a lot in there. There's a lot to talk about in there. I was reading something recently. I think it was a survey that came out probably, I don't remember exactly when, but anyway, I was reading recently a survey where if you look at the time being spent in the office by small firm lawyers and solos, they're spending at least 40% of their day on tasks that are not related to the actual practice of law. So less than 60% of their day, or about 60%, is spent on actually doing legal tasks, and the rest is doing all this business and administrative stuff. Because they tend to try to be everything to everyone, and sometimes it's difficult to outsource certain tasks because you might not have the budget, you might not be able to access somebody who can do those tasks in your area. So that there's a staffing problem, and sometimes it's just an overwhelming need to control our own environments. But all of those things mean that we're doing a lot of tasks that we shouldn't necessarily be doing. So you can take a couple of different approaches. You can either find a way to outsource those using virtual assistants, for example, getting somebody else to answer your phone and schedule your meetings, setting up really easy to use apps that will allow you to create tasks and scheduling directly out of an email, for example. I use Spark for my email, and I can create a task out of there by just clicking a button, and it sends it right into my Trello board, and I manage all of my work on my Trello board, so I can choose the board and the list and whatever. So I've created a number of just little automations that are built into a lot of systems that we use every day that mean I don't have to do some of that administrative and scheduling work. So there's that you can do. You can look at those administrative and scheduling, administrative and business processes that are taking up that 40% of your day, and you can find ways to make those more efficient so they take less time. Maybe that means that you have to outsource your accounting. Maybe you need to hire an expert for a short period of time who can take all of that time that you're spending on accounting, look at what you have to do, and make the rest of it invisible so that your accounting system operates in the background. Accounting, I know, is a huge issue for a lot of small firms. Some of the straight up business of managing your assistant and the HR involved in that can be complicated. If you have a couple of employees, then you suddenly are spending a lot more time on the HR issues. If it's not something that you know intimately how to do and can do really quickly, it's something you should outsource. And even if it is something that you can outsource and you can teach someone else to do it really quickly, you should outsource it. So I'm a huge believer in outsourcing whatever you can. And whatever you can't outsource, that you do everything in your power to make those tasks more efficient.
Yeah, I think from my perspective of having been in this spot, it seems a little bit crazy to create a system for, say, taking out the garbage when things are exploding around you. But really, I think what you're saying, Karen, what I would say is that if you look across all the connected pieces of getting your client from "Hi, how are you?" to "We're super happy," if you look across that chain and you say, "Oh, there's an explosion and there's an explosion," if you solve that problem with the system, you solve it one time. And then forever it is solved. And what we're doing now is we're solving that problem as an original thing every time.
Single day. Yeah. And that's what happens all the time. This is what I was saying about this whole sort of 30 seconds here, 30 seconds there. People aren't taking the time to create the system, create the process, or teach someone else how to do it, because in the moment, it does seem faster to just do it yourself. But all those little minutes that you're wasting taking out the garbage or figuring out your system or trying to remember how it was that you put a new task into your case management system, all these things that someone else could do for you, every single time that you're wasting a minute, it adds up. So, I use an example with a lot of my clients. If you can save a minute off of one routine task that you do 5 times a day, you are going to save 20 hours over the course of a year. If more than one of you in the office is doing it, it gets larger and larger. So you might let's say you put, 20 minutes into figuring out how to reduce 1 minute off of a task that you're doing regularly 5 times a day. You spend that 20 minutes once and you get 20 hours at the end of the year to do something else more important. And if you're a solo, that more important may be new business development. It may be servicing a client differently or better in your office, taking a few more minutes with that distraught client in your office. Or it may be getting home in time for your kids' basketball game.
Right. And again, I really just want to drive home this point that this is going pro, to bring it back to the writing thing. And again, read that book, The War of Art. All these things that he calls the resistance, these are the things that are causing the explosions in your life, that are making it so you're not doing that R&D work, you're not doing that pro work, the expert work that creates the insights that is actually what people want. So I would, again, all these things that we talk about, it always sounds so nerdy when we talk about it, but really it's the difference between I'm a kind of part-time writer, I'm a part-time insight machine, to this is what I do, I've gone pro. So to kind of wrap up, I want to ask a few quick questions, and we've talked about these things, but maybe get kind of a quick summary, some take-home messages. So first, what do you think is a lawyer's deliverable?
Well, I can give you the lawyer's answer and say it depends, but no, I think that we provide solutions or resolutions, and we provide peace of mind and reassurance. And most of all, we provide information. So when we provide that information, it's only valuable if our recipients can understand it. And they can only understand it if we tailor it to the audience appropriately, if we deliver it in a way that they can understand it. So if you're sending an email, they're only going to look at the first 2 or 3 lines in their viewing pane, then you need to get the most important information into the first 2 lines, because that's all that most people are going to see. If you're presenting something in a document that's on screen, people read differently on screen. So you have to present that information in a way that people can read it, which means short chunks of information, short sentences, lots of white space. If we're delivering information, then it has to be in a format that the recipient can understand it.
And finally, how do we systematize learning our craft and taking that seriously, setting aside the time to really get great at insight generation?
It's a challenge because people always tell me they never have enough time. But you have to take time to make time. That's, it's like you have to spend money to make money. You have to take time to make time. And if you're talking about learning how to communicate better and learning how to deliver that deliverable, which is information, better, then there are a couple of different ways that I would recommend. One is that you think about what you're writing in any format that you use. So take a couple of extra seconds in every single piece of writing that you produce. And I'm talking about texts, I'm talking about email, I'm talking about the longer documents. But think about editing every single one of those, because really a lot of these issues when we're writing is that people don't take the time to edit them properly. So check for spelling, check for grammar, check for typos, make sure you've got the right apostrophes in every piece of writing, even the little ones. And then it becomes a habit, so that every single time that you're writing, you take that 30 seconds at the end to read it over. So that's just in terms of the mechanics of writing. if you're talking about, getting more time for ideation, for building that in, then you have to have some of the other systems in place to relieve you of some of those business and administrative tasks, so that you can then focus that extra time on sitting down and thinking about putting all your ideas on paper and then spending time really culling through them and building your arguments. But you can only do that if you've already relieved yourself of the pressure that you're feeling from all of these other tasks that are lurking in the background.
Thank you. And finally, on a personal note, if I can share a quick story. Yesterday, because it's relevant, yesterday, my son graduated from high school, and he did it through a GED program. He wants to go through a college program, and he had been homeschooled, so he needed to get that quickly. Last night at the ceremony, a man who went through the program got up and he spoke, and he said he was at the store, he was at Walmart with his family, everybody was fighting, and there was a book, and he decided just on a whim to pick up this book, and he shared with us that he was 33 years old and had never completed a book before, had never read a book beginning to end. And he said that when he read that book, it made him believe that he could be a guy who reads books. And then he started picking up Stephen Hawking, and then he went through a program that really changed his life. My point is to say, when we make that commitment to go pro, to give people not words that are part of some forum, that are part of some process, but to really do the insight generation and that difficult work of a professional, overcoming the resistance by creating these kinds of habits or systems, that we have real impact on people's lives. And if what we see ourselves as is people who monopolize access to words and then you have to pay us in order to understand them, we're not doing that professional work. And so I would encourage people, go pro, change lives. It works. Anyway, Karen, thank you. Tell me, if people want to follow up with you to learn about creating these habits and systems that make it so they can do their best work, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
The best way is to send me an email, and my email is Karen@Gimbal Canada, Gimbal Canada.com. And you can find my website there as well. And I would absolutely love to talk to anybody about how to create better systems in their offices and in their work life so that they have more time to devote to things like writing.
Awesome. Thank you again, Karen. And thank you, everybody, for watching Insights from Casetext. Join us again next time. We will talk about writing and going pro, how you do this expert work. Thanks. See you next time.